The Scottish coast in early April of 1894 possessed a particular quality of light that only a glazier would notice. Sharp, clean, almost crystalline in its clarity after the morning rain. Our man, 38 years of age and carrying the tools of his trade in a worn leather case, observed this light with professional appreciation as the carriage wound its way up the coastal road toward Strathmore Estate. 20 years of working with glass had taught him to read light the way sailors read wind. The estate revealed itself gradually through the mist, and what a revelation it was. The main house, built of that distinctive gray Aberdeen granite, seemed to grow from the cliff itself, while below, the skeletal framework of iron and wood marked the future conservatory, his destination, his commission, his challenge for the next 2 months. Lord Malcolm Strathmore proved to be one of those progressive aristocrats who seemed increasingly common in these modern times. At 52, he carried himself with the confidence of inherited wealth tempered by genuine curiosity about the world's innovations. "Belgian plate glass," he said, running his hand along the wooden frame already in place. "The finest available, or so my architect assures me." The glazier nodded, recognizing quality when he heard it. He'd trained in Edinburgh under masters who'd installed the great windows of the Royal Botanic Garden, but this project, this would be something special. Each pane would measure 8 feet by 6, larger than anything attempted in these parts before. "My niece Margaret insists we need proper tropical conditions," Lord Strathmore continued, gesturing toward the house where a young woman in practical dress could be seen directing servants carrying wooden crates. "She's brought back specimens from India that require very specific environments." The head gardener, introduced as Duncan Macready, stood nearby with the expression of a man watching his territory invaded by foreign forces. 61 years of Highland blood and 30 years of tending these grounds had given him proprietary rights that no mere lord could override. "Glass houses are unnatural," he muttered, though not quite low enough to escape hearing. "Plants should grow where God intended." Our glazier had heard such complaints before. In his experience, the secret to working on grand estates lay in acknowledging everyone's expertise while quietly pursuing one's own craft. He examined the iron framework with practiced eyes, noting the precision of the joints, the quality of the metalwork. This was no amateur's folly, but a serious undertaking. Margaret Sinclair approached with the purposeful stride of someone who'd learned to navigate both jungle paths and drawing rooms with equal confidence. At 29, she possessed that particular combination of enthusiasm and competence that marked the new generation of educated women. "You must be the glazier from Aberdeen," she said, extending her hand in a gesture that would have scandalized her grandmother. "I do hope you understand the importance of consistent temperature. My Dendrobium nobile absolutely cannot tolerate drafts." The glazier assured her that his seals would be perfect, though privately he wondered at the wisdom of trying to recreate Indian heat in Scottish coastal weather. Still, he'd learned long ago that the wealthy would have their whims, and his job was to make those whims watertight and weatherproof. Thomas Blackwood, the estate manager, appeared with ledgers and schedules, a man who clearly believed that civilization rested on proper documentation. At 45, he'd reached that age where efficiency became a religion. "Your materials arrive tomorrow," he informed the glazier. "The crane has been tested, the pulleys inspected. We cannot afford delays. His lordship has promised a grand opening in June." The glazier spent the remainder of the day examining every angle, every measurement. The salt wind from the North Sea would be his primary enemy here, that and the temperature differentials between the heated interior and the Scottish spring. He made notes in his small leather journal, sketching solutions to problems that hadn't yet manifested, but surely would. As evening approached and the household gathered for dinner, to which he, as a craftsman, was naturally not invited, he took his meal in the kitchen with the senior servants. Mrs. Ellen Fraser, the housekeeper, presided over this lower kingdom with quiet authority. She studied him with the calculating gaze of someone who'd seen many workers come through these doors.
"You'll be staying in the cottage by the stables," she informed him. "Breakfast at 6, lunch at noon. His lordship doesn't approve of work on Sundays, but you'll find he makes exceptions when deadlines approach." Through the kitchen window he could see the conservatory framework silhouetted against the darkening sky, and beyond it, the sea. Tomorrow he would begin the delicate process of installing glass panels that would transform this skeleton into a crystal palace. The thought should have been purely professional, but something about this place, these people, this particular configuration of ambition and tradition suggested that his time here would involve more than simple glazing work. By mid-April, the conservatory had begun its transformation from skeleton to skin. Our glazier had installed 3 of the massive panels, each one requiring a full day's careful work with block and tackle, assisted by estate laborers who handled the glass with the nervous reverence usually reserved for religious relics. The Belgian plate glass was indeed magnificent, clear as water, without the green tinge of cheaper varieties. It happened on a Thursday morning, the 15th of April to be precise. Duncan Macready burst into the conservatory just as the glazier was preparing the 4th panel, his weathered face pale despite the exertion of running. "Come see this devilry," he commanded, forgetting in his agitation the proper hierarchy of address. The phenomenon was indeed striking. On the interior surface of the 2nd panel, an intricate pattern had formed overnight, delicate as frost, branching like frozen ferns across nearly half the glass. Yet the morning was mild, well above freezing, with that soft dampness that marked Scottish spring.
"The breath of death," Duncan declared with Highland certainty. "I've seen it before, 40 years past, on the window of a dying man's room. This project is cursed." He crossed himself, a gesture that seemed to encompass both Catholic heritage and older, darker beliefs. The glazier approached the glass with professional curiosity rather than supernatural dread. The pattern was beautiful in its complexity, fractals before anyone had coined that term, nature's geometry written in what appeared to be condensation but wasn't quite. He touched it gently. The surface was dry, slightly rough, as if etched by an invisible hand. Lord Strathmore arrived within minutes, word traveling through the estate's invisible network of servants faster than telegraph. He studied the pattern with the expression of a man trying to decide whether to be fascinated or concerned. "Can you explain this?" he asked the glazier.
Here was the delicate moment that every craftsman faces. Admitting ignorance risks losing credibility, but false confidence courts disaster. "I'll need to observe it properly," the glazier replied carefully. "Glass can behave strangely under certain conditions." Margaret Sinclair appeared next, carrying one of her mysterious crates from India. She set it down and approached the glass with scientific interest. "How extraordinary! It resembles the patterns frost makes, but also—" She paused, tilting her head. "Like the branching of blood vessels, or rivers seen from great height." "Unnatural is what it is," Duncan insisted. "Mark my words, no good will come of forcing tropical heat into Scottish soil." It was at this moment that Alastair Strathmore made his entrance, or rather, his carefully orchestrated arrival. Lord Malcolm's cousin had that particular bearing of younger sons and elder cousins who'd spent their lives adjacent to but not possessing great wealth.
At 47, he maintained the appearance of prosperity through careful tailoring and strategic visits. "My dear Malcolm," he said, embracing his cousin with apparent warmth while his eyes fixed on the mysterious pattern. "I came as soon as I received your letter about the conservatory. How ambitious!" Then, seeing the frost-like manifestation, his expression shifted to concern. "Good Lord, what is that?" Duncan needed no encouragement to repeat his death's breath theory, embellishing it with additional details about Highland curses and the folly of defying nature. Alistair listened with rapt attention, occasionally glancing at Lord Malcolm as if gauging his cousin's reaction. The glazier, meanwhile, had retrieved his journal and begun sketching the pattern. Something about it nagged at his professional memory. He'd seen similar formations, though where escaped him. The branching was too regular to be random, too perfect to be natural condensation. "Perhaps," Alistair suggested with studied casualness, "this is a sign that the project is too ambitious. These modern innovations sometimes overreach, don't they? There's wisdom in tradition." Lord Malcolm's jaw tightened slightly, a detail the glazier noticed while pretending to study his sketch. "Nonsense! There's a rational explanation for everything. Isn't that right?" This last directed at the glazier with a tone that made it less question than command. The glazier nodded slowly. "In my experience, my lord, glass mysteries usually have glass solutions. I'll need to observe when and how these patterns form. With your permission, I'll spend tonight watching." Mrs. Fraser appeared at the conservatory entrance. "Begging your pardon, my lord, but the gentleman from Edinburgh has arrived about the accounts." She looked meaningfully at Alistair, who suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. As the group dispersed, Margaret lingered, studying the pattern with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. "My father once wrote about something similar in his journals from India," she said quietly to the glazier. "Patterns that appeared on glass during the monsoon season. He thought it had to do with electricity in the air." The glazier filed this information away while maintaining his focus on the mysterious frost. That night, he would begin his vigil, but already his mind was categorizing possibilities. Temperature differentials, humidity, air pressure, chemical residues from cleaning. The breath of death was dramatic, certainly, but in his experience, death rarely announced itself with such artistic flair. As evening approached and he prepared for his watch, he noticed Alistair in animated conversation with a well-dressed stranger near the stables. A man whose bearing suggested neither servant nor local gentry, but something altogether more urban, more urgent. They spoke in low voices, but the stranger's gestures had the unmistakable character of someone discussing money owed. The last week of April brought unseasonable warmth to the Scottish coast, and with it a peculiar tension that seemed to permeate Strathmore Estate like morning fog. Our glazier had maintained his nightly vigils for 10 days now, documenting every appearance of the mysterious patterns with the methodical precision of a man who understood that truth lived in details. The patterns appeared irregularly, sometimes 2 nights in succession, then nothing for 3 days, then again on a particularly windy evening. Each time the formations were similar but never identical, like signatures from the same hand but written in different moods. He noted everything in his journal: wind direction, always from the northwest, humidity, invariably low, and most curiously, they only manifested on panels installed on specific days. During daylight hours, work continued on the conservatory. 5 more panels were now in place, transforming the structure into something that caught the light like a massive jewel. Lord Malcolm visited daily, his enthusiasm seemingly undampened by the mysterious manifestations, though the glazier noticed him studying the affected panels when he thought no one was watching. It was Alistair who proved most persistent in his concerns. He'd extended his visit indefinitely, taking every opportunity to guide conversation toward the troubling phenomena. "My dear cousin," he said one afternoon, loud enough for the workers to hear, "perhaps we should consult someone from the Royal Society. These manifestations might indicate something structurally unsound." The glazier, balanced on scaffolding 20 feet above, kept his focus on the putty knife in his hand, while his ears tracked the conversation below. He'd learned much by appearing absorbed in his work while the gentry discussed their affairs with the casual assumption that craftsmen were deaf to anything beyond their trade. Margaret Sinclair had become an unexpected ally in his investigations. She possessed a scientific mind unconstrained by the supernatural fears that gripped Duncan and several of the younger servants. "I've been corresponding with a colleague of my late father's in Edinburgh," she confided one morning, finding the glazier examining the latest pattern with a magnifying glass. "He mentions something called electrical deposition, particles attracted to charged surfaces." The glazier straightened, interested. This aligned with his own growing suspicions. "Does he say what might cause such charging?" "Friction," she replied, consulting a letter she'd brought. "Wind against glass, particularly in dry conditions." Though he notes it's usually too weak to see without special conditions. Those special conditions, the glazier was beginning to suspect, were being deliberately created. He'd found traces of a fine, almost invisible powder on the exterior of the affected panels, so subtle he'd initially dismissed it as ordinary dust. But ordinary dust didn't arrange itself in careful distributions that exactly matched where the patterns would later appear. Alistair's financial difficulties had become increasingly apparent to anyone paying attention. The glazier had observed 3 more visits from Edinburgh men whose dress and manner suggested neither friendship nor regular business. One particularly tense encounter had ended with Alistair promising resolution within the month, a promise that seemed to hang on some expected change in circumstances. Thomas Blackwood, the estate manager, had begun his own quiet investigation, though of a different sort. "The household accounts show unusual purchases," he mentioned to Mrs. Fraser within the glazier's hearing. "Talcum powder, in quantities no respectable household requires." Mrs. Fraser, who managed to be everywhere while appearing nowhere, had her own observations. "Mr. Alistair has been walking the grounds at odd hours," she noted while supervising tea service. "Always near the conservatory, always when he thinks no one's watching." The glazier began to see the shape of things, like a pattern emerging in glass, not all at once, but gradually, as light shifted and revealed what was always there. Yet proof and suspicion were different creatures entirely, and he'd learned that the wealthy required more than a working man's word to believe uncomfortable truths about their own. On the 28th of April, a particularly dramatic manifestation occurred. The pattern covered nearly an entire panel, branching like lightning frozen in time. Duncan was beside himself, threatening to quit if this devil's work continued. Several of the younger servants were genuinely frightened, and even Lord Malcolm seemed shaken. "Perhaps," Alistair suggested over dinner, the glazier heard about it later from Mrs. Fraser, "we should consider whether you're entirely well, cousin. The strain of this project, combined with these inexplicable phenomena,
It might be affecting your judgment." It was a masterful stroke, the glazier had to admit. Plant the seed of doubt about Lord Malcolm's mental fitness, water it with mysterious occurrences that defied explanation, and wait for it to bloom into something that might shift inheritance or at least management of the estate. That night, the glazier didn't go to his usual observation post inside the conservatory. Instead, he positioned himself in the shadows outside, where he could watch both the glass and anyone who might approach it.
The wind was picking up from the northwest, dry and steady. Perfect conditions for the patterns to manifest. He waited with the patience of a man who'd spent years waiting for glass to cool, for putty to set, for the exact right moment to score a perfect cut. His vigil would be rewarded, he felt certain. The truth, like light through glass, always found a way to reveal itself. Early May brought Dr. James Hartley to Strathmore Estate, though whether by coincidence or design remained unclear. The local physician, 56 years old, with the careful precision of a man who'd seen enough of life to trust evidence over assumption, had ostensibly come to examine Lord Malcolm for what Alistair had been describing as nervous exhaustion brought on by the troubles at the conservatory. The glazier encountered him first, not in the main house, but in the conservatory itself, where the doctor stood studying the latest pattern with a peculiar instrument, a brass rod connected to a glass sphere that he held near the affected panel. "Electroscope," Dr. Hartley explained, noting the glazier's interest. "Crude, but effective. Watch the gold leaves inside." Indeed, two delicate gold foils within the sphere spread apart as he brought the device closer to the patterned glass. Static electrical charge, without question. Here was an educated man speaking the language of science rather than superstition. The glazier shared his observations about wind patterns and the mysterious powder traces, finding in the doctor an eager audience for empirical evidence. "I've been conducting my own experiments with electrical phenomena," Dr. Hartley confided, his Edinburgh accent marking him as another outsider in this Highland setting. "What you're describing sounds remarkably like the work of Heinrich Lichtenberg in Germany. He created similar patterns using electrical discharge through insulating materials." Together they spent the morning testing various panels. The doctor's electroscope revealed residual charges on all the affected glass, strongest where the patterns were most elaborate. More intriguingly, they found traces of charge on panels that hadn't yet shown patterns, as if they'd been prepared but were waiting for the right conditions. Margaret Sinclair joined them, bringing her father's journals from India. "Look here," she said, opening to a marked page. He described something similar during the dry season in Bombay. Patterns on the windows of the government house that the local servants attributed to evil spirits, but which he believed were electrical in nature. The glazier studied the sketches in the journal. The resemblance was unmistakable. "Your father was a careful observer," he noted. "He was more than that," Margaret replied with a mixture of pride and something else, perhaps regret. "He was investigating irregular accounting in the colonial administration when he died. He believed in documenting everything." That afternoon, while installing another panel, work must continue regardless of mysteries, the glazier observed Alistair greeting another visitor from Edinburgh. This man had the unmistakable bearing of a solicitor, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested legal documents rather than social correspondence. Their conference was brief but intense, ending with Alistair's visible agitation. Dr. Hartley, meanwhile, had set up an impromptu laboratory in the estate's unused morning room, much to Thomas Blackwood's carefully controlled dismay. "Science requires space," the doctor declared, arranging various apparatus on tables meant for tea service. "We're going to reproduce these patterns under controlled conditions." The glazier provided glass samples, cut from the same Belgian sheets used in the conservatory. Dr. Hartley had borrowed equipment from the Natural Philosophy Department at Aberdeen, a static electrical generator that looked like an instrument of medieval torture, but was, he assured them, the latest in scientific apparatus. "The principle is simple," the doctor explained as he cranked the generator. "Create a charge differential, introduce fine particles, and watch them arrange themselves along the field lines." He dusted talcum powder onto a charged glass plate, and within seconds, delicate branching patterns began to form. Not identical to the conservatory manifestations, but close enough to establish the connection. Mrs. Fraser, who'd been finding reasons to pass by the morning room with unusual frequency, finally entered with tea service. "If I might observe, sir," she said to the doctor with careful deference, "I've noticed these patterns only appear on nights when Mr. Alastair takes his evening constitutional." The doctor and glazier exchanged glances. Here was corroboration from an unexpected source. Mrs. Fraser continued arranging teacups with studied innocence. "Of course, many people walk in the evening. It's merely a coincidence, I'm sure." That evening, the glazier positioned himself differently for his vigil. Instead of watching the conservatory directly, he found a vantage point that commanded a view of the paths leading to it. Dr. Hartley joined him, bringing a flask of what he claimed was medicinal whiskey for the cold. "If someone is deliberately creating these conditions," the doctor mused, "they'd need to apply something to the exterior of the glass that would enhance natural static accumulation. In dry, windy conditions, the effect would be dramatic." They didn't have long to wait. Just past midnight, a figure emerged from the house. Not Alastair, surprisingly, but a man the glazier didn't recognize, carrying what appeared to be a bellows. He moved with practiced stealth toward the conservatory, and they watched as he began puffing some substance onto the exterior of the newest panel. "Shall we confront him?" Dr. Hartley whispered. "Not yet," the glazier replied. "We need to know who's directing him." Evidence, he'd learned, was like properly set glass. It needed to be complete before it could bear weight. The middle of May arrived with unseasonable clarity, as if the Scottish weather itself had decided to illuminate what had been hidden. Our glazier had spent the past week documenting everything with the meticulous care of a man building a case as carefully as he'd build a window frame. Each piece of evidence fitted precisely to the next. The mysterious figure with the bellows had returned 3 more times, always between midnight and 2 in the morning, always when the wind was rising from the northwest. The glazier and Dr. Hartley had taken to alternating their watches, comparing notes each morning over tea in the doctor's makeshift laboratory. They'd collected samples of the powder, confirmed its composition as finely milled talc mixed with something else, lycopodium powder, Dr. Hartley determined, commonly used in theatrical effects for its high flammability and, more relevantly, its exceptional response to electrical charge. Margaret Sinclair had made her own discovery among her father's papers. "Look at this," she said one morning, spreading documents across the morning room table where the glazier was examining glass samples. "Letters between my father and Uncle Malcolm from 1873, discussing irregularities in the colonial administration's construction contracts. Father suspected someone was skimming funds meant for public works." The glazier studied the letters, noting names and dates with professional interest. One name appeared repeatedly, a contractor who'd apparently fled India under mysterious circumstances. "This contractor," he asked carefully, "did your father ever discover what became of him?"
He died in Edinburgh 5 years ago, Margaret replied. But his son manages properties there now.
I believe Uncle Malcolm mentioned he handles some of Cousin Alistair's business affairs. The pieces were aligning like properly cut glass, each edge finding its match. That afternoon, while working on the conservatory's upper panels, the glazier observed Alistair in heated discussion with Thomas Blackwood. The estate manager's normally composed expression showed cracks of genuine concern. "The household accounts cannot support these additional expenses," Blackwood was saying. "If his lordship were to review them in his current state of anxiety—" "His current state is precisely why he shouldn't be troubled with such details," Alistair countered smoothly. "As his cousin and nearest male relative, I'm simply trying to protect him from unnecessary stress." The glazier continued his work, letting his hammer ring against the frame in steady rhythm while his mind processed what he'd heard. That evening, he made an unexpected discovery. While cleaning the interior of an affected panel, preparing to seal it properly, his cloth caught on something nearly invisible, a thin wire no thicker than a hair running along the frame's edge. Dr. Hartley examined it with growing excitement. "Copper, unless I'm mistaken. And see here, it's been grounded to the iron framework. This would significantly enhance the electrical accumulation." "When was this installed?" the doctor asked. The glazier checked his records. Every affected panel had been installed on days when he'd been called away for urgent consultations about materials or measurements, diversions that, in retrospect, seemed deliberately timed. During those absences, the frame preparations had been completed by estate workers supervised by someone else. Mrs. Fraser provided the crucial information that evening, approaching the glazier as he prepared for another night's vigil. "You should know," she said quietly, "that Mr. Alistair's man from Edinburgh, the one who claims to be his valet, worked in a theater before entering service. Stage effects were his specialty, or so the kitchen maid discovered." The revelation crystallized everything. The theatrical bellows, the lycopodium powder, the carefully timed applications. It all spoke of stage magic transformed into something more sinister. But knowing and proving remained different challenges, especially when the accused was the Lord's own cousin. That night brought dramatic vindication. The wind rose as predicted, and the glazier watched from concealment as the supposed valet appeared with his bellows. But this time, Alistair himself followed, staying in the shadows but clearly directing the operation. They could hear him speaking, the wind carrying fragments of instruction. "More on the upper corner. Ensure it's visible from the house." Dr. Hartley gripped the glazier's arm, ready to confront them, but the glazier held him back. They needed more than observation. They needed physical evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. He waited until the two men had departed, then quickly but carefully collected samples from the freshly dusted panel, scraping the powder into small glass vials he'd prepared for this purpose. By dawn, a new pattern had formed, the most elaborate yet, spreading across the panel like frozen lightning. Duncan, arriving for his morning rounds, took one look and declared he'd resign if this devilry continued. Several servants were openly talking of curses, and even Lord Malcolm seemed wan and troubled when he appeared at breakfast. "Perhaps," Alistair suggested with perfectly manufactured concern, "we should bring in alienists from Edinburgh. These delusions about curses and supernatural phenomena might indicate a broader issue with the estate's management." The trap was closing, the glazier realized. Alistair was moving toward his endgame, having Lord Malcolm declared incompetent, assuming control of the estate and solving his financial difficulties in one masterful stroke.
But the glazier had spent 20 years reading the stress points in glass, knowing exactly where to apply pressure to achieve a clean break. He understood that timing, in exposure as in glazing, was everything. Late May brought a crisis to Strathmore Estate that had nothing to do with weather or glass. Lord Malcolm had taken to his bed, overcome by what Alistair described to anyone who'd listen as nervous collapse brought on by these supernatural manifestations. The truth, as the glazier suspected and Dr. Hartley confirmed, was simpler. Mild exhaustion exacerbated by laudanum that someone had been adding to his evening brandy. The conservatory stood nearly complete now, 12 panels installed, catching the morning light like a cathedral of glass. But work had effectively stopped.
The servants whispered of curses. Duncan had made good on his threat to resign, though he still haunted the grounds like a dispossessed spirit. And Alistair had summoned what he called medical experts from Edinburgh to evaluate his cousin's mental state. These experts arrived on the 25th of May, two men whose credentials seemed impressive until Dr. Hartley made discreet inquiries. One was struck off the medical register 3 years ago, he informed the glazier privately. The other specializes in committing wealthy relatives to asylums for concerned families. They're hired witnesses, nothing more. The glazier watched from his scaffolding as Alistair orchestrated his final moves. Legal documents appeared, papers that would transfer temporary management of the estate to the nearest competent male relative should Lord Malcolm be deemed unfit. The Edinburgh creditors circled like carrion birds, apparently assured of imminent payment. Margaret Sinclair refused to accept this coup quietly. "My uncle is being poisoned," she declared to anyone within hearing, though her youth and gender made her easy to dismiss as hysterical. She found an ally in Thomas Blackwood, whose loyalty to proper accounting transcended his usual deference to class. "The talcum powder purchases," Blackwood noted, reviewing his ledgers with the glazier and Dr. Hartley. "They were authorized by Mr. Alistair but charged to general household expenses. Nearly 2 pounds of the substance over 6 weeks. Enough to powder every baby in Aberdeen." The glazier had spent years learning to see through glass, to spot the tiny flaws that could shatter under pressure. Now he saw the fatal flaw in Alistair's plan. His assumption that a working man would remain silent, that a glazier would care more about his fee than the truth. It was a miscalculation born of the very arrogance that made the scheme possible. On the morning of May 27th, Alistair made his formal move. He gathered the household, the visiting doctors, and several local worthies in the main drawing room. Lord Malcolm, pale and confused from the laudanum, sat propped in a chair while Alistair presented his case. "These manifestations have clearly affected my dear cousin's mind," he declared with practiced sorrow. "He speaks of electrical experiments, of Indian curses, of patterns with meaning. The doctors here can attest to his deteriorated mental state." The hired doctors nodded gravely, producing documents already prepared. The local magistrate, summoned for official witness, looked uncomfortable but seemed inclined to accept the medical opinion. Mrs. Fraser stood with the servants, her face carefully expressionless, while Margaret barely contained her fury. It was then that the glazier stepped forward, something no craftsman should do in such august company. "Begging your pardon, sirs, but I can't explain the patterns." Alistair's face showed a flash of alarm before recovering. "This is hardly the time for a tradesman's theories." "Not theories," Dr. Hartley interrupted, moving to support the glazier. "Scientific facts. We can demonstrate exactly how these patterns are created."
What followed was as carefully orchestrated as any of Alastair's schemes. The glazier produced his samples, his documentation, his careful notes showing the correlation between the patterns and the mysterious powder applications. Dr. Hartley explained the electrical principles, demonstrating with his equipment how talc and lycopodium powder would adhere to charged glass in exactly the observed patterns.
Furthermore, the glazier continued, his voice steady despite the social transgression of addressing his betters, these wires were installed in the frames without my knowledge, specifically to enhance electrical accumulation. He produced one of the copper wires, thin as a hair, but damning as a signed confession. Alistair attempted to rally. These are wild accusations from a man trying to cover his own inferior work. But Margaret had her moment. I have here correspondence between Cousin Alistair and certain Edinburgh creditors, she announced, producing letters that Mrs. Fraser had quietly provided. They discuss the imminent acquisition of estate funds following a change in management. The magistrate, suddenly very interested, examined the letters. The hired doctors began edging toward the door. Lord Malcolm, the fog of laudanum clearing slightly, looked at his cousin with growing comprehension. You used my trust, Lord Malcolm said quietly, and the pain in his voice was worse than any anger. My blood, my cousin, and you would have had me committed for your debts? Alastair's composure finally cracked. You don't understand the pressure. The creditors threatened exposure, scandal, the family name. The family name, Lord Malcolm replied with sudden strength, survived the Jacobites, the clearances, and countless other trials without resorting to fraud and attempted murder of the mind. The revelation hung in the air like the morning's light through the conservatory glass, clear, undeniable, illuminating everything it touched. The glazier watched as Alastair's elaborate construction collapsed, each support failing in sequence like poorly installed panels in a storm. The 1st of June arrived with a kind of crystalline clarity that the Scottish coast rarely offered, as if nature itself had decided to provide perfect conditions for what would unfold in the conservatory of Strathmore Estate. Our glazier had spent the previous 3 days preparing his demonstration with the meticulous care of a man who understood that truth needed not just to be known, but to be seen. Lord Malcolm, recovered from his laudanum fog and restored to his full faculties, had insisted on a formal inquiry, not a criminal proceeding, that would bring scandal the family could ill afford, but a thorough demonstration before witnesses who mattered. The local magistrate, 2 legitimate physicians from Aberdeen, the minister, and several neighboring landowners whose opinion carried weight in the county. The conservatory had been transformed into a theater of science. Dr. Hartley had arranged his electrical apparatus along one wall, while the glazier had prepared several glass panels in various states of treatment. Most importantly, they had left one of the affected panels untouched, its mysterious pattern still visible in the morning light, like a ghost captured in crystal. Alastair stood near the door, technically free, but effectively imprisoned by social disgrace. His creditors had been quietly paid from his mother's jewelry, sold with Lord Malcolm's grudging assistance to avoid broader scandal, but his position in the family was destroyed. He watched the proceedings with the hollow expression of a man seeing his carefully constructed world rendered transparent. Gentlemen, Dr. Hartley began, addressing the assembled witnesses. What you've been told are supernatural manifestations are, in fact, predictable natural phenomena
deliberately induced through scientific principles discovered by George Christoph Lichtenberg in 1777. The glazier demonstrated first with clean glass, showing how no amount of wind or temperature change produced the patterns. Then he applied the mixture of talc and lycopodium powder with the theatrical bellows they'd confiscated from Alistair's accomplice. "This powder is so fine, it's invisible once distributed," he explained, "but it carries a unique property. It responds dramatically to electrical charge." Dr. Hartley cranked his electrical generator, building up static charge in the copper wire system. The glazier had installed an identical wire along this demonstration panel's frame, showing how it had been hidden in the putty seam. As the charge built, and the wind machine they'd borrowed from the Aberdeen Theatre created airflow across the glass, the witnesses gasped. Before their eyes, the powder began to organize itself into patterns, delicate, branching, eerily beautiful formations that exactly matched the mysterious manifestations. The Lichtenberg figures grew like living things, spreading across the glass in fractal geometries that seemed both random and purposeful. "In nature," Dr. Hartley explained, "these patterns appear in many places. Lightning strikes on grass, electrical discharge through insulators, even in the human body when struck by lightning. They're God's own geometry, if you will, but certainly not supernatural." The minister, an educated man despite his Highland congregation, nodded thoughtfully. "So the patterns that frightened my parishioners were simply dust and electricity?" "Precisely," the glazier confirmed. "But applied deliberately at night, when the wind conditions were perfect. The copper wires ensured strong electrical accumulation, the powder made the effect visible, and the timing created maximum fear and confusion." Margaret Sinclair had prepared her own contribution to the demonstration. She'd found in her father's Indian journals detailed observations of similar phenomena during the dry season in Bombay. "My father documented these patterns appearing naturally on windows during dust storms," she explained. "The local servants attributed them to spirits, but he proved they were electrical in nature. Cousin Alistair must have known about these journals. He helped settle Father's estate." The revelation that Alistair had used knowledge gained from a dead relative's scientific observations for fraud added another layer to his perfidy. The assembled witnesses looked at him with expressions ranging from disgust to pity. Thomas Blackwood presented the financial evidence with his characteristic precision. Receipts for powder, payments to the theatrical valet, correspondence with creditors that showed timing coordinated with the manifestations. The picture that emerged was of a desperate man using intelligence and family trust for the basest purposes. "But why such an elaborate scheme?" the magistrate asked. "Surely there were simpler ways to address financial difficulties?" Lord Malcolm answered, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "Because he needed me not just dead, but declared incompetent. An inheritance from a madman draws less scrutiny than one from a murdered man. And if I were merely financially ruined, I'd have sold land, reduced his expectations." "Only madness would transfer complete control while keeping me alive to sign documents." The glazier demonstrated once more, this time showing how simple window cleaning with ammonia solution removed all traces of the powder and eliminated the patterns completely. He'd cleaned half of one affected panel, leaving the other half as evidence. The contrast was stark. Mysterious pattern on one side, perfect clarity on the other. Duncan Macready had crept in during the demonstration, drawn by curiosity despite his resignation. Watching the scientific explanation unfold, his weathered face showed the struggle between Highland superstition and observable fact. "So there's no curse?" he asked finally. "No curse," the glazier assured him. Just powder, copper wire, and a man's greed. Mid-June brought resolution to Strathmore Estate with the weight of summer rain after drought. The truth, once revealed, spread through the county like water finding its level, seeping into every conversation, every judgment, every sideways glance at society gatherings. Our glazier continued his work on the conservatory's final panels, but now he worked in an atmosphere transformed. The supernatural dread replaced by something more complex, a mixture of relief and disillusionment. Alistair's departure had been swift and silent, Lord Malcolm displaying the mercy that comes from either nobility or exhaustion, had provided him with passage to Australia and a small sum to establish himself there. "He remains my blood," Lord Malcolm had said simply, though everyone understood the unspoken condition, that this blood never again darkens Scotland's shore. The glazier had watched Alistair's final morning at the estate, observed him standing before the conservatory as dawn light caught the glass panels.
For a moment, the ruined cousin had looked like what he might have been: intelligent, capable, even artistic in his understanding of natural phenomena. Then the carriage had arrived, and he'd departed without backward glance, his theatrical valet already dismissed and disappeared into Edinburgh's anonymous streets. Margaret Sinclair had emerged from the affair with unexpected authority. Her botanical knowledge, previously dismissed as feminine hobby, had proven crucial in understanding the scientific principles at work. Lord Malcolm, recognizing both her intelligence and his own vulnerability to manipulation, had appointed her as unofficial advisor on estate matters. She'd taken to the role with natural grace, organizing the conservatory's completion with efficiency that would have impressed her late father. "We'll need proper ventilation for the electrical discharge," she told the glazier one morning, studying his technical drawings with competent eyes. "If static accumulation was the problem, we must ensure it doesn't occur naturally." The glazier appreciated her practical approach. Together, they designed a grounding system that was both functional and invisible. Copper strips hidden within the iron framework, connected to rods driven deep into Scottish earth. No more mysterious patterns would appear on these windows, whether by nature or design. Dr. Hartley had become a regular visitor, bringing his electrical apparatus to conduct legitimate experiments that fascinated the recovering Lord Malcolm. "Science used for deception," the doctor said one afternoon, "must be countered with science used for education." He'd begun giving lectures to the estate workers, explaining electrical phenomena in terms they could understand, slowly dismantling the fear that Alistair had so carefully cultivated. Duncan Macready had returned to his position, though changed by the experience. The glazier found him one evening standing before the conservatory, no longer seeing cursed glass, but rather a monument to human ambition, both noble and base. 20 years ago, Duncan said quietly, I'd have believed the curse unto death. Now I don't know whether to be grateful for education or mourn the loss of mystery. The glazier understood this sentiment. In revealing the mechanism of deception, they'd also stripped away some essential magic from the world. Yet there was, he reflected, a different kind of magic in understanding. In knowing how light bent through glass, how electrical charge created patterns, how human greed could corrupt even family bonds. Thomas Blackwood had conducted a thorough review of estate finances, discovering the full extent of Alistair's preparatory embezzlement. Small amounts over 2 years, always attributed to legitimate expenses, had funded his scheme while simultaneously deepening his debt. He was stealing to fund the plan to steal more, Blackwood observed with professional disgust.
a spiral as predictable as those electrical patterns. Mrs. Fraser, whose network of information had proven invaluable, now moved through the estate with subtle satisfaction. She'd been instrumental in preserving evidence, having suspected Alastair's character long before his schemes manifested. "Servants see everything, understand more than they're credited with," she told the glazier. "We simply lack the power to act on what we know." The conservatory neared completion as June progressed. Each panel the glazier installed now carried the weight of recent history, but also promise. Margaret's botanical specimens had arrived from storage: exotic orchids, rare ferns, species unnamed by Western science. They would transform this glass structure from scene of attempted crime to cathedral of natural philosophy. Lord Malcolm had recovered physically, but the glazier noticed changes.
The Lord now questioned more, trusted less readily, sought multiple opinions on matters previously decided by instinct. Whether this was wisdom or wound remained to be seen. He'd taken to visiting the conservatory each evening, standing among the growing plants, perhaps finding in their foreign beauty some restoration of wonder that his cousin's betrayal had stolen. The legal matters concluded quietly. The magistrate, satisfied by the demonstration and evidence, had closed the inquiry with minimal documentation. Alastair's creditors, paid from the sale of his mother's estate, had no reason to pursue matters. The hired doctors had fled to whatever shadows sheltered such men. The theatrical valet had vanished entirely, though rumors placed him in London, applying his powder and bellows skills to more honest stagecraft. The glazier's work was nearly finished. 2 more panels remained, their installation delayed by June rains that drummed against the completed sections like nature's own percussion. He worked now with deep satisfaction, knowing that his craft had served not just construction, but justice, that his careful observations had prevented a good man's destruction. The final days of June 1894 brought the glazier's work at Strathmore Estate to its conclusion. The last panel was installed on a morning of such perfect clarity that the completed conservatory seemed less a structure than a captured piece of sky, its glass walls dissolving the boundary between Scottish coast and tropical ambition. Our craftsman stood back to survey his work with the particular satisfaction known only to those who build with their hands. Every seal was perfect, every angle precise, every panel aligned to create not just shelter, but transformation of light itself. The mysterious patterns that had once threatened this project were now just memory, replaced by transparent truth. Margaret Sinclair had transformed the interior into something remarkable. Her orchids bloomed in defiance of latitude. Her ferns created a jungle understory that belonged more to Bengal than Britain. She'd acquired a collection of butterflies, chrysalises imported at considerable expense, and they'd begun emerging in the warm, humid air, their wings catching light through the glass like living, stained windows. "My father would have loved this," she said, finding the glazier making his final inspections. "He believed in bringing worlds together, in proving that boundaries were more mental than physical." She paused, watching a butterfly navigate between Indian orchid and Scottish sunlight. Though he also learned that some boundaries people will kill to maintain. The glazier understood she meant more than botanical borders. The revelation about her father's investigation into colonial corruption, the connections to Alastair's Edinburgh associates, had opened questions better left unexplored. Some truths, like some glass, were too dangerous to handle directly. Lord Malcolm had regained much of his former vigor, though tempered now with caution that aged him beyond his 52 years.
He'd taken to spending hours in the conservatory, not just admiring the plants, but studying them, as if understanding their foreign nature might explain the exotic betrayal that had bloomed in his own family. "You saved more than you know," he told the glazier one evening, as they stood watching sunset through the western panels. The light transformed the glass into sheets of gold, then copper, then deep purple as the sun descended toward the sea. "Not just my estate or sanity, but my faith in observation, in facts over fear." The glazier accepted this with characteristic reserve.
He'd learned long ago that the wealthy needed to see themselves as saved rather than merely assisted. That gratitude was easier to bear when it felt like recognition rather than debt. Dr. Hartley had become a regular fixture at the estate, his electrical experiments now conducted openly with Lord Malcolm's enthusiastic support. They'd established a small laboratory in the conservatory's north corner, where they investigated the properties of light through various solutions, the effects of electricity on plant growth, the boundaries between science and wonder. "You know," the doctor mentioned to the glazier, "those Lichtenberg figures we exposed weren't just destruction of mystery. They revealed a pattern that exists throughout nature, in river deltas, blood vessels, lightning strikes, tree roots. Sometimes explaining magic doesn't destroy it, but shows it's more magical than we imagined." Duncan Macready had made his peace with the conservatory, though on his own terms. He'd taken charge of the mechanical systems, the heating pipes, ventilation louvers, the complex arrangement of gutters and drains that kept tropical warmth from drowning in Scottish rain. "If we're going to define nature," he'd declared, "we'll do it properly." The glazier appreciated this practical acceptance. Duncan might never love the conservatory, but he'd protect it with the same fierce dedication he showed the traditional gardens, because it was now part of his domain, his responsibility, his craft. On his final evening at Strathmore, the glazier attended an unusual gathering. Not the formal dinner he wouldn't have been invited to, nor the servants' meal he'd grown comfortable with, but something Margaret had arranged in the conservatory itself. She'd had tables brought in, lanterns hung from the iron framework, creating an enchanted space between worlds. Present were all who'd helped expose the truth: himself, Dr. Hartley, Mrs. Fraser, Thomas Blackwood, even Duncan. Lord Malcolm presided, but without the formal distance of class. Here, under glass and growing things, they were conspirators in truth, allies in the preservation of justice. "To clarity," Lord Malcolm raised his glass, the wine catching lantern light like liquid ruby. "Both in glass and in character." They drank, and conversation flowed with unusual ease. Mrs. Fraser revealed she'd known about Alistair's debts for months, having a cousin in service at his Edinburgh residence. Blackwood admitted he'd started keeping duplicate ledgers when the powder purchases began, sensing something amiss. Duncan confessed he'd never truly believed in curses, but found them useful for keeping people from interfering with his gardens. The glazier listened more than spoke, storing these revelations like tools in his leather case, implements that might never be needed, but were valuable to possess. He'd learned that every great house had its mysteries, its patterns of deception and revelation, its need for someone who could see clearly through whatever medium obscured truth. As the evening concluded and guests dispersed, Margaret approached him with an envelope. "Your payment," she said, "plus what Uncle Malcolm calls a bonus for services beyond glazing." The envelope was heavy, suggesting generosity born of genuine gratitude rather than mere obligation. Tomorrow he would return to Aberdeen, to smaller jobs and simpler mysteries. But tonight, surrounded by his completed work,
by glass that would stand for decades as testimony to both craft and character, he allowed himself the rare indulgence of complete satisfaction. 1 year later, in June of 1895, our glazier returned to Strathmore Estate for the conservatory's grand opening.
The invitation had come as a surprise. Craftsmen rarely witnessed the social triumph of their work, but Margaret Sinclair's hand was evident in the gesture. She'd written that his presence was essential, that the story wouldn't be complete without its central observer. The train journey from Aberdeen carried him through countryside transformed by early summer abundance. Scotland had dressed itself in green velvet and golden light, as if preparing for the celebration ahead. The glazier noticed how different his anticipation felt this time, not the nervous energy of a craftsman approaching new work, but the deeper satisfaction of returning to see something proven by time. The estate appeared before him like a painting he'd once helped frame. The conservatory stood complete, magnificent in afternoon sun, its glass walls now softened by the green shadows of mature plants within. What had been skeleton, then scandal, had become sanctuary. Through those transparent walls, he could see tropical abundance thriving in Scottish soil. Margaret's vision realized, Lord Malcolm's ambition vindicated, his own craft elevated to art. Lord Malcolm greeted him personally at the entrance, a gesture that spoke volumes about changed perspectives. The Lord had aged gracefully in the year past, his hair more silver, but his bearing stronger, as if surviving betrayal had reinforced rather than weakened his foundations. "You'll find everything much changed," he said, leading the glazier not to servants' quarters, but to a guest room in the main house. "We've learned to see things differently here." The conservatory's interior had evolved beyond recognition. What had been empty glass and iron now housed a world unto itself. Orchids cascaded from upper reaches, their blooms like scattered jewels. Ferns created grottos of green shadow. Butterflies moved through humid air like animated flowers. The Lichtenberg figures that had once threatened this paradise were now merely a story told to visitors, a reminder that beauty and deception could wear identical faces. Margaret had become the conservatory's presiding spirit, her knowledge now respected rather than merely tolerated. She'd published papers on tropical cultivation in temperate climates, bringing scientific recognition to Strathmore. "Your glass made it possible," she told the glazier as they walked among her specimens. "Perfect clarity, perfect seals. No drafts to murder my orchids, no distortions to confuse their phototropism." She showed him her latest triumph, a night-blooming Sirius that would open that very evening for the gathered guests. "It blooms once a year, for a single night," she explained. "Rather like truth, don't you think? Rare, brief, but unforgettable when witnessed." Dr. Hartley had established a permanent laboratory in the estate's east wing, his electrical experiments now funded by Lord Malcolm's patronage. He'd published a paper on Lichtenberg figures that carefully omitted the criminal application while thoroughly explaining the science. "We've turned infamy into education," he told the glazier, "though I've kept samples of Alistair's powder mixture for purely scientific purposes, of course." The evening's celebration drew county society in its finest plumage. The glazier, uncomfortable in borrowed evening clothes, found himself in the unusual position of honored guest rather than invisible craftsman. People who would have looked through him a year ago now sought his opinion on their own conservatory plans, their window troubles, their desire for modern glass installations. Duncan Macready, restored to his position and elevated to head groundskeeper, had made his own peace with progress. He had integrated the conservatory into his domain, creating outdoor gardens that complemented the interior tropical display. "Nature's nature," he'd told the glazier with Highland philosophy. "She adapts to whatever madness men create." As evening deepened, lanterns were lit throughout the conservatory, creating a fairyland of light and shadow. The assembled guests gathered to witness the night-blooming Sirius, its petals beginning their once-yearly opening. The glazier stood at the edge of the crowd, observing both flower and audience, noting how wonder remained constant, whether inspired by mystery or understanding. Mrs. Fraser appeared at his elbow with a glass of wine. Good wine, not the servant's portion.
"Mr. Alastair writes from Melbourne," she said quietly. "He's established himself in the wool trade. Apparently he has a talent for recognizing quality fleece. One wonders if he's checking it for electrical properties."
The glazier smiled at her dry humor. They stood together watching the Sirius bloom, its petals unfurling with deliberate grace, releasing perfume that seemed to contain whole tropical nights. Around them, society murmured appreciation, but he noticed Margaret watching with deeper satisfaction, the look of someone seeing not just beauty, but proof of concept, vindication of belief. Later, as guests dispersed into the June night, Lord Malcolm found the glazier standing before the panel where the first Lichtenberg figure had appeared. The glass was perfect now, clear as air, showing only the reflection of lantern light and the shadow of palms beyond. "Do you know what I've learned?" Lord Malcolm asked, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "That clarity isn't the absence of deception, but the ability to see through it. Every man who looks through these windows sees something different. Beauty, achievement, investment, nature conquered or celebrated. The glass remains neutral, honest. It's we who bring the distortion." The glazier considered this, running his hand along a perfectly sealed frame. In his craft, he'd learned that glass was never truly solid, but a liquid moving too slowly to perceive. That transparency was an illusion created by aligned molecules. That strength came not from thickness, but from proper tempering. Perhaps people were similar, appearing solid while slowly flowing, seeming transparent while hiding complex structures, gaining strength not from rigid thickness, but from surviving heat and pressure. The next morning he would return to Aberdeen, to his workshop and waiting commissions. But tonight, surrounded by his greatest work, witnessing its transformation from mere building to living achievement, he understood that some jobs transcended craft to become stories, that some windows opened onto more than views, that sometimes a simple glazier could change the way light entered the world.